You may not know it, but your company needs to get from I to Y. The I stands for your big investments in growth strategies, new markets, new programs, mergers and acquisitions. The I also stands for initiatives, both inside and outside your company, operational changes, new processes designed to move the needle. And I also stands for introductions, new products, new geographies, where you've put big bucks into differentiating yourself from the competition and finding new customers. Speaking of customers, Y stands for customers. Actually, customers saying yes to any of your I's. In order for any of your investments, initiatives, or introductions to give your company a lift, you got to get your customers to say yes. But there's a big gap between I and Y, and we call it the status quo barrier. Now more than ever, customers are finding it harder, and they're taking longer to say yes to anything that you do that's new or different. There's 4 reasons for this. The first is the attention economy. Customers don't have the time or the bandwidth to listen, learn, and figure out what you're doing. The second is risk aversion. Everyone has their heads down as they continue to ride out this walk through the economic La Brea tar pits. Third is change burden. Frankly, your customers are more willing to live with the pains of their current situation than deal with the pain of changing to something new that you're trying to sell them. And finally, entrenched alternatives. Your competitors, their current suppliers, aren't standing still, and they're working hard to protect their turf. So the question really becomes, what's it going to take for you to break through the status quo barrier and make sure that your investments, initiatives, and introductions are something the customer will care enough about to do something different, and care enough about to say yes to you? Do you know this guy? He's the famous author Malcolm Gladwell. Most people are familiar with his popular book, The Tipping Point. He sold millions of copies of this book and made millions of dollars telling people how little things make a big difference. He's now seen as the expert on the topic of the tipping point. Interestingly, he didn't even invent the idea. This guy did. Morton Grodzins. Morton is the original scientist who first discovered and explained the concept of the tipping point. Yet no one knows him. Try as hard as I couldn't even find a picture of Morton Grodzins on the internet. So what did Malcolm Gladwell do that Morton Grodzins didn't? Why was Malcolm Gladwell able to make millions from an idea that this person invented, but apparently didn't get anyone to take notice of? Malcolm Gladwell messaged it great. He messaged it great. Morton Grodzins didn't. The same concept. One person succeeded in getting the buying public to say yes and fork over the dollars for the book, and the other guy lives in obscurity. Malcolm then went on to use his fame to launch another book that sold millions and again made him millions. In this book, Outliers, he described a concept called deliberate practice. But you guessed it, he didn't invent the concept or the science behind deliberate practice. This guy did. Do you ever hear of him? How do you think his book did? Here's how the lesson of Malcolm Gladwell can be applied to your business. In order to make sure that your big business ideas, investments, and initiatives and introductions break through the status quo barrier and get your customers to say yes, you need to message it great. Great messaging is what's going to keep the I on the left-hand side from becoming irrelevant. And let's face it, companies today can probably recover from bankruptcy faster than they can recover from irrelevancy. Okay, so let's talk about how you can make your messages great. The 4 contributing factors to the status quo barrier are shown here in close-up because they become your considerations for how your messages need to be developed in order to break through that barrier. So let's take a quick look at each one and how it impacts your ability to message it great. In the attention economy, it's almost impossible to get people's attention anymore. Time is the new currency. To get someone's time, you can't be timid in your messaging. In fact, you often need to tell the prospect or customer something they don't know about a problem they didn't even know they had. This means your message may need to be a little bit dangerous and fearless instead of the traditional safe and self-satisfying value proposition. What are you saying that's provocative enough to get your listener to pay attention and come to the edge of their seat? Are you telling them something new and fresh? In the case of risk aversion, here's a truth you need to consider in your messaging. Risk aversion says that people respond better and faster to the threat of loss than they do to the potential for gain. So you need to make sure inside your messaging that your feature benefit stories and your ROI calculations also incorporate emotional messaging that speaks to the imminent risks that must be avoided by your prospects or customers, showing them where their status quo is leaking and squeaking, I always like to say. You need to actually show them why their status quo is unsafe. This is required if you want to move them off of status quo. No surprise here, customers loathe change. So much so that they're often willing to live with the pains that they have because they perceive the pain of changing to a new solution as being worse than the pains they're living with. Breaking through the status quo barrier means you have to clearly show them how the pain of not changing is worse than the pain of change management. Finally, whether it's a traditional competitor or an in-house solution, incumbency has its advantages. It's safe and comfortable. Your competitors are not standing still. They won't give up their customers willingly, so you clearly have to contrast your approach with theirs and show enough differentiation in order to prove value. Once you've conquered these 4 factors when it comes to breaking through the status quo barrier, you have to realize that that kind of a messaging activity doesn't just happen once with a customer and you're done. There are multiple great messaging moments of truth that require you to break through with multiple audiences. It starts with executives that must inspire and rally the troops with a vision for your go-to-market strategy. You then must convince analysts or other opinion leaders in your outside community that you are a recognized leader and you deserve an up and to the right placement in the Magic Quadrant. Then you need to get your target prospects to care enough to raise their hands and show interest in your distinct point of view. After that, you have to convince them to actually do something different and choose you over a competitive alternative. Once inside, you then want to land, expand, and increase your footprint and become a strategic partner. Finally, you need to protect your installed base and make sure they stick with you. In every one of these cases, you have to ask yourself, how well is my messaging and the delivery of that messaging breaking through the status quo barrier? Now, while you're thinking of that, as if you didn't have enough to think about, here comes New Forrester research that states 88% of your executive level buyers at your customers believe it's important that your great messages be framed as a conversation as opposed to a prepared slide deck presentation. So messaging it great means you have to have a great message, but you also have to deliver it great, which means you're going to have to step away from the projector, turn on the lights, and get ready to deliver a different, remarkable, and memorable conversation instead of presentation. From here on out, messaging it great in the business world means it's just you, a marker, and a writing surface. Corporate Visions is helping companies such as Oracle, Dell, ADP, and GE message it great, and they're doing it on purpose versus by accident. Creating and delivering great messages and conversations like that is a 3-step process. The first step is to identify problems that your customers and prospects don't even know they have yet. Problems that you can solve better than anyone else, and turning that story into a distinct point of view for your company. Breaking through the status quo barrier, specifically overcoming the attention economy, risk aversion, and change burden, requires that you say something so provocative that your customers have to take notice and deal with it, or they put their key outcomes and objectives at risk. The second step is to turn your distinct point of view into a high-impact visual conversation and story that you can tell in a way that connects with your prospect both emotionally and rationally and helps them literally and clearly see why they need to change, why they need to do it now, and why they need to do it with you. The third step then is practicing, refining, and owning that story so that the delivery is as great as the message. Bringing your message to life is more than just drawing it on a flip chart or a whiteboard. It's about engaging the customer in a compelling, remarkable, and memorable conversation that's different from anything else they've ever seen or heard. This three-step approach can be used at every moment of truth along the customer conversation continuum. So starting tomorrow, how will you transform your presentations into a powerful, visually rich, interactive conversation? Now that you know 88% of your executive buyers don't even want to see your slide deck. And how will you make your abstract ideas more concrete and your complex concepts more simple so that they break through the status quo barrier? How will you make sure you are messaging it great, where it counts, when your lips are moving in front of your company, analysts, and customers? If you're interested in learning more about what you've heard in this webinar, check out the new book, Conversations That Win the Complex Sale, recently released by McGraw-Hill. For listening to this webinar, we're going to give you a free sample chapter. You can get it simply by clicking on the book on the right.